Welcome back to Philosophy 1101, Problems of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut. This week we'll be talking about the nature of the mind, not necessarily the human mind only. In answer to the question what kinds of things there are, in the broadest possible sense of those terms, there are two general styles of answer, one of which is known as monism, the other of which is known as dualism. The monist answer says there's just one kind of thing. And that monistic answer takes either of two forms. Either, and this is the most common form of monism, physicalism or materialism, I'm using those terms interchangeably for our purposes here, says all things are physical. Everything, including thoughts, including beliefs, including conscious experience, are physical things or reducible to physical things in a strict, someday to be defined notion of reducibility that we may have to come back to later on. Whereas another form of monism says that everything is mental, that in some sense the whole world is just made out of ideas. Now, that's a more exotic view, one associated with the philosopher and cleric Bishop Berkeley. Not one we'll be pursuing in this class, but in a more advanced philosophy course on, for example, empiricism, you might well find yourself delving deeply into that idealistic tradition. As opposed to monism is the philosophical view known as dualism. The dualist, as you can imagine, says there are two kinds of things. And the most common form of dualism will say the two kinds of things that there are, first of all, mental things, minds, for example, and the other kind of thing that there is are physical things. So the dualist says there are two kinds of things ultimately. They're mental and physical, and neither one is reducible to the other. In order to get a better fix on the nature of mentality or the mind, as we pursue this conversation, I think it's helpful to distinguish among three different types of mental phenomena. And these are things that either a dualist or a monist can agree upon. This is sort of neutral as between those previous answers to the metaphysical question. First of all, one important aspect or component of the mind are the cognitive elements thereof. That includes things like thought, knowledge, memory. Essentially, cognition is primarily about the processing of information. Cognitive science is very much involved with understanding how human and other minds are able to process information in order to get around and survive in the environment in which we find ourselves. Contrasting with the cognitive aspect of the mind is the affective, where affect has to do with emotions and moods. I'm going to distinguish between emotions and moods in the following way. Emotions are mental phenomena such as fear, such as hope, such as regret. You can feel fear or feel hope or feel regret, where there always has to be an answer to the question, what are you fearful or hopeful or regretful about? Those emotions, those things are emotions by virtue of the fact that they always require a kind of content. What the mind is directed towards, so to speak, that makes up the content of the emotion. Whereas by contrast, you can have an affective state that is a mood that does not require, it's not mandatory that it have a content. So I might be in an anxious mood simply because I've drunk too much coffee. Now, in that case, there need to be no answer to the question, what am I anxious about? I might just be anxious because of too much coffee, or I might be lackadaisical, or I might be somber simply because I've been listening to somber music or I've been surrounded by somber people. And there might not be any answer to the question, what am I somber about? I just am somber. And that's the mood, which distinguishes itself from an emotion because emotions, as I've said, mandate contents and answer to the question, what's the emotion about? Whereas moods permit but do not mandate those contents. That is the affective dimension of the mind, which includes both emotions and moods. And the third general category of mental phenomena that I want to distinguish is that of experiences, the experiential component of the mind. People sometimes refer to this as with the word qualia, or the qualitative aspect of the mind. And I'm talking about sensations, the experience of bitter, the touch of something smooth, the feel of something warm, a prick of pain in your arm as you brush up against something sharp. Those are all examples of experiential states. Likewise, when I'm conscious of my surroundings, when I'm paying special attention to the thought processes that I'm going through, perhaps when I'm paying attention to the contents of my own mind in the way that Descartes would want us to do on certain occasions, that would be an example of the experiential component of the mind engaging in conscious awareness of its own contents. And of course, you can be consciously aware of things outside of you as you gaze around the room that you're in or other aspects of the environment that you're surrounded by. So these three components of the mind are cognitive, affective, and experiential. And notice that in a single situation, you can have all three components or aspects activated. So suppose, for example, that you've got an orange in your hand. Now, the cognitive component might be one that allows you to see, yes, I'm aware of the fact that there's an orange here. That is, that's something that you know to be the case. So that's cognitive. You might have an affective dimension that's brought up. For example, that orange might remind you of a very nice experience that you had with someone of romantic interest back in your youth, back in your high school days, for example. That might bring up a good experience, a happy kind of recollection. There's memory, but there's also a good feeling that you have. That's the affective component. And likewise, the experience of the orange, the feel of its skin, the smell, maybe you'll bite into it and taste some of it. Those are all experiential components of your situation, your interaction with that orange. Those are three aspects of the mind then. And I want to remind you that Descartes, being a dualist, holds that mind and body are not just distinct, but distinct in kind, such that mental phenomena are never identical with anything physical. So your mind is not identical, not just not identical with your body, but not even identical with your central nervous system. And remember, he argued that because he clearly and distinctly perceives that it's possible that he could exist without his body, he therefore has the modal property of being capable of existing without his body, but his mind does not have that modal property, that property of being capable of existing without his body. He couldn't have his body existing without existing. And therefore his mind and body have distinct properties, therefore they're not identical. Descartes, notice, has a very simple and therefore very powerful argument for dualism, and we need to think hard about precisely whether or not that closes the case, whether that shows conclusively that mind and body are distinct in kind. Another argument that we might consider, also in the sixth meditation, known as the divisibility argument, contends as follows. Any piece of matter can be divided. This is a pre-atomistic physics in which believers, scientists at this time, held that matter is infinitely divisible. Many mental things, however, cannot be divided. It doesn't make much sense to talk about cutting your thought about the Eiffel Tower in half or looking at the bottom part of your thought about the Eiffel Tower. So matter has the property of being capable of being divided, whereas mental phenomena do not have that property. Therefore, once again, same structure, mind and matter are distinct. Now, you might ask yourself whether this divisibility argument is as powerful as is the body detachment argument. There might be more reason for ways of challenging it, but Descartes took himself to have two different routes to his dualistic position, both of which were going to be, for him, adequate to show that the mind is distinct from anything physical. And we need to ask ourselves, is that the only game in town? Is there a non-dualistic position that allows us to think about the nature of the mind? Now, a dualist has to answer some hard questions. There are some difficulties with the dualistic position. They're well known. Then two of the most famous are as follows. First of all, the problem of mind-body interaction. Because after all, it seems just obvious that mental and physical things interact. Sometimes I have the thought that I want to raise my finger, and lo and behold, my finger goes up. I have the thought that I want to say hello to my friend who I see across the street, and I say hello to her, a mental phenomenon causing a physical change, and it looks like the same thing could go in the other direction, a physical change bringing about a mental phenomenon, a physical change such as exposure to my retina from the photons that bounced off that person, and that caused the mental change of my thinking that I would like to say hello to my friend. But if mental phenomena are distinct from anything physical, it's not clear how mental phenomena could be causally interacting with the physical world. And yet it seems part of our common sense experience that minds and bodies interact all the time. So that's one problem. The problem of mind-body interaction is an issue that any dualist has to try to face up to. And likewise, it looks like, as part of common sense, I can often know a great deal about the mental states of others than myself. That is, for those people that I know fairly well or better, such as my spouse, my children, my parents, my close friends, people that I work with and have worked with for a long time, I feel like I'm reasonably confident in my ability to make ascriptions to them of what's going on in their mind. I know this person is angry. I know this person is jealous. I can see clearly on her face that she's experiencing some trepidation, etc. These are judgments that we make about one another all the time. I'm not saying we're always right. I don't want to claim that we're never mistaken about these things, but we make these judgments with a fair bit of reliability, fair bit of confidence. Now, That seems to be part of a common sense, but if you're a dualist, it becomes a kind of mystery how it's possible to know about anybody else's mind, because if minds are non-physical, one could, for example, never do better than to make a hypothetical judgment, a conjecture about what's happening with someone else mentally that can never be established, because after all, suppose you were to remove their brain from their cranium and look inside, all you would see would be neurons interacting with each other, never any thoughts, if you're a dualist. And so it looks like you'll never be able to establish conclusively whether or not any other individual than yourself has thoughts. And that seems to fly in the face of common sense, in the sense that many of us take it as part of our everyday experience that we know the thoughts of others and do so, generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, with a fair bit of confidence. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the 20th century philosopher Gilbert Ryle wanted to try to show not that so much that Descartes had a mistaken view, but that he had a confused view about the nature of the mind. And in so doing, Ryle tries to push back against Descartes' dualistic position in order to show that the whole discussion about the relationship between the mind and the body is in a way on a wrong track. So Ryle wants to argue that Descartes' view about the nature of the mind is confused about what a mind is. And in particular, he wants to accuse Descartes of having committed what he calls a category mistake. And a category mistake, insofar as he describes a category mistake, it goes as follows. A category mistake is a confusion about the logical status of a concept. It's a misunderstanding of the sort of concept that we're dealing with when we try to use it in our thought and discourse. So for example, suppose that your friends were talking with you about their plans for the upcoming summer, and they tell you they're planning on riding their bikes across the United States in search of the average taxpayer. They hope to meet the average taxpayer and shake hands with that person and maybe be invited to dinner at her or his house, hang out with the average taxpayer, and then continue on the journey all the way to the other coast. You might say, perhaps putting it very politely, I'm sorry, that's a nice idea. I hope you have a great bike ride, but I don't think you're ever going to meet the average taxpayer, because after all, the average taxpayer is just an abstraction, just a kind of definition of a mathematical kind that's defined in terms of all the taxpayers, the number of them, and the amount of tax that they pay or income that they earn. That's just a mathematical construction that doesn't correspond to anything in physical reality. Just as, suppose you were to have some relatives come and visit you here at the university, and you gave them a tour, you showed them the central buildings, you showed them the classrooms, the professors, the students, and so forth, and then at the end of the day, one of your visiting family members said, hey, you know, I had a great time seeing the buildings and the faculty and the students and all the people who take care of the campus and the sporting events and so forth, but I still haven't seen the university. If someone were to say that, I think you'd feel that they're confused, because you might feel like the university just is all those things interacting with each other appropriately, efficiently, effectively. The university is not some extra thing over and above all the individuals that make it up. It's just those things interacting with each other in an effective and smooth and efficient way. So too, Ryle is going to argue, Descartes commits a category mistake in his thinking about the mind, because he's construing the mind as a substance of a certain kind that's independent of all the physical things and tendencies that we have to do physical things throughout our lives. Insofar as he does that, Ryle claims, Descartes is confused about the nature of the mind and commits a category mistake about that very thing. So why does Ryle think that Descartes commits a category mistake? Well, here's the general idea. Ryle says intelligence is not an extra thing that's lying behind behavior and causing it. Rather, it's a feature of a certain kind of behavior itself. So, for example, Ryle will claim you can see intelligence in the very actions that people perform and tend to perform. Examples such as clowning in a witty way, or playing tennis in a cunning way or aggressive way, playing chess in such a way as to, for example, dominate the center of the board. That's one manifestation of intelligence. It does make sense to ask the question, well, he's playing chess really well, but I wonder whether it's an intelligent way of playing chess. Playing chess well just is to play chess intelligently. Or imagine somebody who's a sensitive conversationalist. If they're behaving in such a way as to converse sensitively, giving the other speaker plenty of room to say what they want to say, listening carefully, responding empathetically, trying to draw out their interlocutor whenever possible, those are all behaviors that make up what it is to converse sensitively. And insofar as they're behaviors that make up conversing in a certain way, that sensitive conversation practice just is a form of intelligence. So Ryle wants to say, behaving intelligently is not a matter of having a non-physical substance causing your physical actions. Rather, behaving intelligently is a matter of doing things of a bodily kind in the world in an effective way, in such way as to get done what needs to get done. So Raoul will say, if you think about it, having a non-physical soul substance, so to speak, inside of you, you could have one of those and still be completely stupid, still be completely lacking any intelligence. That's not what it is to have a mind. What it is to have a mind is to act, and more precisely, to be disposed to act in an intelligent way. And if you've got that, there's no further question whether or not you're a creature that has a mind. So Descartes will, let me try it again. Raoul will say, if you've ever seen the movie Forrest Gump, you know that Forrest's mother says, and Forrest himself often quotes her as saying, "Stupid is as stupid does." So too, Raoul would say, that's true, and smart is as smart does. And you might come back and refine that by saying, smart is as smart does, or tends to do. Why do we say tends to do? Well, Raoul wants to make use of the notion of a disposition. And insofar as he wants to do that, he wants to give us examples of, for instance, what it is to say that a piece of salt or a shaker full of salt is soluble. When we say the salt is soluble, we're not saying that it's actually dissolving right now. Rather, what we're saying is that it's disposed to dissolve under certain conditions, for example, being immersed in an unsaturated liquid. So saying X is soluble just means if X is put in water and the water is unsaturated, etc., then X will dissolve. Likewise, what does it mean to describe your friend George as a careful driver? Well, saying George is a careful driver does not require that he's driving right now. George can be a careful driver and be fast asleep. In saying that George is a careful driver, what you mean is that when he is in a situation in which he's driving a car, he tends to do things such as check his blind spot before changing lanes, give plenty of room to the driver in the car in front of him, check what's in front of you and behind you when backing up, etc. Those are all aspects of what it is to be a careful driver, and those, notice, are all behaviors, ways of driving the car that George is disposed to engage in when he's in the right situation. So Raoul will say, stupid is as stupid does or tends to do, and so too, smart is, intelligent is as intelligence does or tends to do. You can be perfectly intelligent while doing nothing at all, so long as you are disposed to behave, to act in certain ways. That's what it is to have a mind. That's what it is to have intelligence. So Raoul will say a disposition is a special kind of modal property that's a feature of an object that can only be explained in terms of a proposition of the form, if X were to happen, then Y would happen. The if-then counterfactual kind of form is the sort of paradigmatic way of expressing a disposition, which means even if the thing is not manifesting a feature right now, it's disposed to, and that's what it is for the thing to have that capacity, so to speak. Raoul will take the next step and say, really a mind is a set of multi-track dispositions. And he might say, I'd rather you didn't talk about minds, because that tends to get us on the wrong track in looking for a substance that refers to that noun, mind. Let's talk more about intelligence. Intelligence is a set of dispositions. It's just a set of dispositions that are more complicated and more sophisticated than the disposition that characterizes salt. Salt is what Raoul will call something that has a one-track disposition. If put in an unsaturated liquid, it will dissolve, whereas mentality, intelligence, is going to be a big collection of dispositions to behavior that are multi-track. So, for example, being forgetful, a defensive chess player, having a dry sense of humor, a rotten speller, a crafty arguer, a reasonably competent dresser, an awesome bird spotter, a good listener, somebody who's impatient about formalities, somebody who's affectionate. These are all aspects of your mind that make you have the qualities that you do, that are also things that dispose you to behave in certain ways. And Raoul will say, if you know enough of these dispositional features of a person, there's no further question to be asked what his mind is like. To ask that further question would be, Raoul will say, to commit a category mistake. You know all that there is you need to know about a person once you know enough of those dispositions. And if you're with us today, he might say, when you meet somebody new, I suspect a lot of what you're doing, either consciously or unconsciously, is trying to keep your radar out for finding out what sort of dispositions that person has. Are they a sensitive listener? Are they forgetful? Are they compassionate? Are they attentive to another person's needs? Are they aggressive? Are they short-tempered? Those are all things you're often paying attention to, even if not consciously, and Ryle will suggest that attention is precisely aimed towards trying to understand what their mind is made of, what kind of mind they have, and Ryle will say if you answer those questions, that's all you need to know about the kind of mind that a person has. So Gilbert Ryle is an interesting philosopher because he wants to argue that, in a sense, the traditional mind-body problem is a confused problem. There's a confusion in asking the question, what kind of substance is a mind? Is it a mental substance, or rather a non-physical substance, or is it a physical substance? Ryle essentially wants to tell us that the mind is not a substance at all. Rather, it's a set of dispositions to behave in various intelligent ways. Now, that's a powerful potential critique of Descartes, and if Ryle's right, then Descartes is indeed confused about the nature of the mind. And Ryle also wants to point out that our intelligence is often bewitched by language. We're often misled by things like noun phrases into thinking that there must be a substance or entity of a certain kind that the noun phrase refers to. This is often the subject of jokes when somebody says, "Who did you see coming down the road?" Somebody else says, "I saw no one coming down the road," to which the first person might ask, well, was he going fast or slow as he was coming down the road? That shows a confusion about the nature of the word no one. No one's not a name. It's a quantifier, as logicians would say, that tells us that there is not any person who is coming down the road. But that takes some deeper insight into the nature of the language. If we don't have that insight into language, then we could be misled. Now, Ryle has a lot to say about the nature of the mind, and the question is whether he gives us enough to be satisfactory. Just as I criticized Descartes on a couple of points, so too we can ask questions that challenge Ryle. So remember, as we said, salt has the dispositional property it does by virtue of its underlying crystalline structure. And if you're a physical chemist, you know how to explain the crystalline structure of salt at the molecular level to tell us how and why it is that it dissolves under certain conditions. Likewise, glass is brittle. That means it's disposed to break under minimal amounts of stress. But if you know enough about physics and chemistry and so forth, you'll be able to explain why glass is brittle in terms of its internal atomic or molecular structure. Now, the Australian philosopher, David Armstrong, who was writing primarily in the 60s and 70s and developing a criticism of Ryle's work from a couple of decades previous to that time, argues that, well, Ryle, we can't really rest satisfied with Ryle's critique of Descartes. While Armstrong will say Descartes was mistaken to adopt a dualistic position, Armstrong wants to argue that so too, just as we don't want to leave it at the level, for example, of salt in saying that it's a disposition, we want to explain where the disposition comes from, what aspect of the salt makes it have the disposition that it does. Armstrong wants to suggest against Ryle that so too, it's only a halfway house to knowledge to say that my mind having the properties that it does makes me disposed to behave in certain ways. Rather, we want to ask, what is it about me that makes me have the properties that I do that make up my mind? We want to understand the internal structure in me, so to speak, that enables me to have the capacity to be empathetic or short-tempered or having a good memory or something of the kind. So Armstrong writes, whereas Ryle and other behaviorists are only partly right, they're not completely wrong, they're only partly right. It's true that mentality is connected up with behavior, but Armstrong writes, when I'm just thinking, when my thoughts do not issue in any action, so for example, suppose I'm just lying down, not moving at all, but I'm thinking, when that happens, it seems as obvious as anything is obvious that there is something actually going on inside of me which constitutes my thought. It is not simply that I would speak or act if some conditions that are unfulfilled were to be fulfilled. Rather, I've got thinking going on right here. So Armstrong wants us to think about not just someone who's asleep, who presumably is not thinking, who is, in spite of the fact that he's asleep, still disposed to drive carefully and play chess craftily, for example. Armstrong wants to remind us that there are other situations in which one can be perfectly immobile, also as immobile as the sleeper, but in this case, actually thinking. You might be doing some mental math. You might be composing some music in your mind. You might be trying to remember some lines from a poem that you knew long ago when you were a child. Those are all cognitive activities, Armstrong will say. They don't issue in at least overt behavior, and nevertheless, they certainly seem to be part of what's happening with me mentally. And Armstrong wants to challenge Ryle by saying to him, how can you, even as a sophisticated kind of behaviorist, how can you account for that kind of phenomenon, those sorts of phenomena in behaviorist terms. So Armstrong will say, granted, thinking, emotion, and such are logically tied to behavior, but these things can't be defined in terms of behavior or dispositions to behavior. Those things don't capture them entirely. There's still, for example, an experience of thinking about something that's not completely captured by my disposition to behave in certain ways. So that is the gravamen of Armstrong's critique of Ryle. And we'll come back and try to develop it in just a moment. Now, Armstrong will say that, granted, a mental state is a cause within a person of certain ranges of behavior, and it's also what is responsible for their so-called multi-track dispositions. To that extent, he's on board with Ryle. He agrees with Ryle. But he wants to argue that we still need to explain those dispositions. What is the non-dispositional, as it were, categorical basis of those dispositions? Armstrong wants to suggest that, well, that might not be something we can know a priori. We might not be able to settle that question in our armchairs, so to speak. He wants to suggest instead that perhaps it's an empirical question, not a question of logical analysis, what those intrinsic causes, what the intrinsic nature of those causes actually could be. And he hypothesizes, he can't know this a priori, no one can, but he suggests that it's, as not too crazy an idea, perhaps a state or a process within the central nervous system that is the basis of thinking and other kinds of mental phenomena, such as emotion and conscious experience. That is, perhaps, Armstrong suggests, thinking is a process within the central nervous system. Now, for many of you, that will sound all too obvious, so obvious as to not be worth saying, but it helps to understand the historical background against which it was formulated, because, for example, Armstrong is responding to Ryle, who is himself responding to a very strong, very powerful, very old tradition of dualistic thinking about the relationship between the mind and the body. It's easy to forget now, important to try to revive our sense of wonder at the idea that somebody could take seriously the thought that mentality, thinking, cognizing, emoting, even experiencing is something that is completely captured by a neuroscientific picture of humanity and likewise other creatures, other biological creatures. So Armstrong writes, we can give a complete account of man, he said man, we can change that to men or women or just people generally, in purely physico-chemical terms. Again, hypothesizing. He wants to suggest that as neuroscience and other related disciplines develop, we'll find that the verdict of modern science is going to be that the sole cause of mind-betokening behavior, that is intelligent behavior, in people and higher animals is the physico-chemical workings of the central nervous system. That thinking is a process in the central nervous system, whether it's something that occurs in human beings or an octopus or an elephant or a crow, insofar as all those creatures can think, and we've got good evidence in each case that they can, then those are just processes happening in the central nervous system, just as digestion is a process that happens inside of your stomach and other connected parts of your gut. So too, thinking is a process that happens inside of your cranium, spinal cord, etc. So just take a bird's eye view of where we are right now. Remember that Ryle seems to have a strong point against Descartes, because he seems to be able to argue with some persuasiveness that Descartes' view of the mind takes it to be a substance, that it's not clear how it's going to interact with anything physical. It's not clear how, if I've got a Cartesian type of mind, I can know about anybody else's. And Ryle argues that Descartes is guilty of a category mistake insofar as he thinks that the mind need not be connected up with intelligent behavior. Whereas Armstrong seems to raise some difficult questions for Ryle. Insofar as Ryle wants to characterize the mind as a set of multi-track dispositions towards intelligent behavior, Armstrong wants to ask, it seems rightly, that one should be able to pursue the question, well, we shouldn't just stop at dispositions, we should try to understand what is the physical basis for the dispositions that make us act in the ways that we do. And Armstrong's answer, his suggested answer, is maybe those dispositions are explainable in terms of aspects, processes, features of the central nervous system. Now, that is to say that Armstrong wants to argue that thinking just is a central nervous system kind of process, just as digestion is a process that happens inside of your stomach and intestines and related organs. So far, so good, but you might ask whether or not Armstrong's position is in a way chauvinistic. After all, we take it to be chauvinistic that, for example, the only way to be a thinking thing, count as truly having a mind, is if you've got a certain skin color. we would reject that position as being chauvinistic. So too, we would reject a position that says you've got to be male in order to count as having a mind, or a full mind, or a complete mind. No, we'll reject a position of that sort and say that gender makes no difference to whether or not you're capable of having a full and complete, highly successful and effective mind. But if we take those positions to be chauvinistic, maybe we should wonder about whether there's some hidden chauvinism inside of Armstrong's view, because he seems to be saying you've got to have a central nervous system in order to count as being a thinking thing. Is that perhaps too narrow, though? If you claim that thinking, emoting, experiencing are brain or at least central nervous system processes, that is, it seems to follow that the only way of having a mind is to be made at least roughly of the same sort of stuff that Homo sapiens are made of, or at least the central nervous system, the white matter and the gray matter that make that up. If you don't have white or gray matter, the Armstrong position seems to imply, then you don't count as a thing that thinks. Now, this might allow, for example, dolphins and chimpanzees the possibility of minds, but it seems to rule out, in principle, the possibility that, for example, a machine could think, that a machine could have one, or you might also imagine extraterrestrial life that develops, perhaps it's alive, it evolves, for instance, at some far corner of the universe, and yet it's made of entirely different stuff. Maybe these creatures are silicone-based rather than carbon-based in the way that we are, and they behave very intelligently. They come to Earth and they beat us in chess and write better poetry than we're able to, and so forth. All their intelligence seems to be all their behavior seems to be highly intelligent, and yet it would seem to be chauvinistic to say, nope, sorry, they don't have a mind because they don't have a central nervous system. That seems to be too narrow. So what can we do by way of trying to improve upon someone like Armstrong's position? Notice also that most of us will be happy to say that many inanimate objects, that is, objects that are not alive, that are not biological organisms at all, don't have mentality. Here's an image of a rock. That rock, most of us would say, it does not have a mind. If you were on a bus heading back home for Thanksgiving or something, and someone sat down next to you on the bus and took a rock like this out of their pocket and started talking to it, you might find yourself wishing you could move seats to somewhere else on the bus, or hope that this person will ignore you or fall asleep soon, because the idea of talking to a rock as if it's got a mind seems kind of crazy. Fair enough. But on the other hand, it looks like maybe the problem with rocks is that it's not so much what they're made of, but rather that they're just too simple. They don't seem to behave in intelligent ways. That suggests the possibility that perhaps a machine of a sufficiently sophisticated kind could count as thinking. And if we imagine machines, perhaps some of which would take the form of a humanoid type, we might wonder whether or not they could think, even if they have silicone chips and wires and things of the kind inside of their so-called bodies. One of the first thinkers to ask whether a machine could think was the mathematician Alan Turing. His dates were 1912 to 1954. He was instrumental in cracking the code used by the Nazis during World War II. He laid some crucial foundations for modern computer science. He also conjectured that it's in principle possible that a computer could be made to think. And he argued for this by means of what is now known as the Turing test in a paper called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. He asks us to imagine the following setup. Suppose you're in a room, and on opposite walls of that room are a computer screen and a keyboard. You're an interrogator, and you're trying to figure out whether the thing, you know that on one wall, behind one screen, is an actual human being, and behind the other screen, the other wall, is a very powerful computer, maybe IBM's Watson or some descendant thereof, extremely powerful computer. And your job is to figure out which is the human being and which is the machine. What's now known as the Turing test is a commonly used example that is supposed to show that if you cannot tell, after doing your very best to try to figure out which is the human being, which is the machine, then on the assumption that the human being you've been interacting with has a mind, you should also infer that the computer you've been interacting with has a mind as well. That is to say, if a computer can pass the so-called Turing test, then that computer should count as having a mind just as much as another human being should count as having a mind as well. So the Turing test suggests that if a machine can pass this test so that you can't tell the difference, you can't tell which wall hides a human being, which wall hides a computer, then the computer, whichever wall it's behind, should count as having a mind. Now, this test has raised many objections. Let's consider a few of them. Somebody might say, look, this is beyond our current technology. To which Turing, I think, would reply, technology goes forward with leaps and bounds. 20 years ago, if Turing were with us today, he'd probably be shocked to see our smartphones, for example, but would get used to it and figure out how they work, and perhaps after a little while get over that shock and be impressed and pleased. So too, he might say, if he were with us now, only the sky's the limit in terms of what computing machinery can do within the next 10 or 20 or 30 years. Our technology might very well be able to build machines that can keep us from being able to tell the difference between the computer and the machine. It seems like it's in principle possible to build a machine that can do the things that Turing suggests it might be able to do. Another objection might be, well, all the machine's so-called intelligence was put there by a programmer or a series of programmers, so it's at best an artificial mind. Why should you call it as considered having a mind at all? To which I think Turing could reply, the fact that the intelligence was put there does not show that it's not genuinely there once it's placed there. So too, a lot of your intelligence was, so to speak, put in you by virtue of the years and years you've had already of being taught, and, so to speak, programmed by teachers and parents and the environment. All the piano lessons and dance lessons and French lessons and so forth you've taken throughout your life thus far, to say nothing of calculus class and history class and so on, have been various ways in which society has programmed you to have the intelligence that you had. The fact that it was put there in your mind by someone intelligent outside of your mind does not show that once it's there, it's not genuine. I think Turing could say the same thing about a computer. Or somebody might reply, wait, the problem with machines is that they can't be spontaneous or serendipitous or kooky. To which I think Turing could reply, you could program a computer to be spontaneous. Suppose you got a random number generator inside of it that whenever it hits upon a certain number that is predefined as being, for example, a multiple of pi, for instance, it always does something that is seemingly random, but in fact not genuinely random. But the human spectators who watch the machine are certainly surprised and didn't expect it to happen. So maybe that seeming spontaneity or serendipity or kookiness could be something that's programmed in the machine in such a way that we're none the wiser. Wouldn't that be enough? And after all, Turing might say, when you think you're being spontaneous or serendipitous or kooky, maybe there's more of a method to the madness than you think. Perhaps there is a basis for that behavior that a deeper analysis of your conscious or unconscious mind could unravel or could reveal. Somebody might say, well, I'm not sure the machine could feel emotion. And I think Turing could say a couple of things about that. First of all, it's not clear that, even though we've talked about three components or aspects of mentality, it's not the cognitive, the affective, and the experiential, it's not clear that in order to have a mind, you have to have all three. What would it be like to be a creature that just has cognition and not affect or experience? Could you have experience without affect or cognition? These are open questions, but Turing might be satisfied with the idea that a machine perhaps couldn't feel emotion as long as it has cognitive capacities. That would still be quite an achievement. First point. Second point, I think Turing could also get us to see that machines could at least act as if they are emoting. You could imagine, suppose, for instance, that you've been working on your laptop for a long time. It's a new laptop. It's the most powerful one on the market. You decided to splurge and get a really excellent laptop programmed with this thing in it called AI. And as you try to power down after a long day, you get a message on the screen saying something like this: please don't turn off this machine. I'm enjoying being here with you. I like the feel of your cool fingertips on my keyboard, for example. Now, the machine might be acting as if it likes you or maybe even loves you. You might say, well, but it doesn't really love me. It's just part of the program, to which I think Turing could say, that might be the case, but how do you justify differentiating that attitude that you have towards the machine from the attitude you have towards a friend who might feel emotions towards you as well? One's made out of wetware, one's made out of hardware. One runs on software, perhaps the other one doesn't, I don't know. But it's not clear how you would justify saying, I know for sure the machine doesn't feel emotion, whereas I know for sure that my friend does. That might be chauvinistic, that might be arbitrary, and Turing might not be quite satisfied with your certainty that sophisticated machines can't feel emotion. Likewise, somebody might worry, well look, machines can't learn in the way that genuine-minded creatures like we people are capable of learning, to which Turing might reply, actually programs can be programmed to learn. That is to say, you could have, for example, there certainly are highly sophisticated chess playing machines that as part of their program are determined to gain information from the games they've played with human opponents already to, so to speak, learn about those opponents' strategies in order to play them more effectively later on. The learning that is programmed in the machine might still be genuine learning, is the point. And so it seems not true that machines can't learn. They can do what very much seems like learning. And then finally, somebody might reply, but the machine's not conscious. To which Turing might reply, consciousness, that experiential or qualitative aspect of the mind, might not be mandatory for having a mind per se. You might ask whether just having cognitive or affective states is enough to count as having a mind, firstly. And secondly, here again, you might ask, how do we know this machine's not conscious? Perhaps it is. If you're certain that it's not, what justifies that certainty in such a way as to make you sure, for example, that the machine's not conscious, even though your friend George is conscious? Both of them are behaving fairly intelligently, but you're sure one's conscious, one's not. What justifies that certainty? Many people impressed by Turing's reasoning as a contribution to our understanding of the mind have taken seriously the idea that perhaps machines either can think now or sometime in the future will be able to think. And that view, the idea that there could be thinking machines, at least is not susceptible to the charge of chauvinism. That is, somebody who thinks there could be thinking machines does not have to hold that you've got to have gray matter or white matter or a combination of the two in order to count as having a mind. So they won't be chauvinistic in the way that perhaps Armstrong seems to be. But if you take seriously the idea of the possibility of thinking machines, then you might ask, well, what is a good model for understanding the mind? And a typical answer from this camp, as it were, from this style of thought, indeed is the computer. So the Turing test offers the suggestion that if a machine can achieve a certain standard of intelligent behavior, then it has a mind no matter what it's made of, and indeed such a machine is normally thought of nowadays as a computer, and this line of thought ends up being embodied in the contemporary movement, set of research programs, set of technologies that fall into the broad rubric of artificial intelligence. I'm sure you've heard that term before. Artificial intelligence is an enterprise spanning computer science, philosophy, linguistics, psychology, and neuroscience, and it's dedicated to the creation of intelligent machines. And artificial intelligence, or AI, comes in two distinct forms. First of all, what you might call weak artificial intelligence. Secondly, what you might call strong artificial intelligence, where weak artificial intelligence says simply, artificial intelligence, from this point of view, says we can learn about the human mind by simulating some of its features on a computer. So, for example, a neural network, a connectionist network, for example, that tried to simulate certain aspects of how neurons work, might say that, for instance, in a connectionist network, we see certain types of learning that are very effective for a machine to whom we're trying, or to which we're trying to teach some language. So weak AI says this can help shed light on the nature of human mentality and the mentality of non-human animals by modeling it, so to speak, synthesizes some aspects of it, and that will allow us to draw conclusions about the nature of mentality by analogy, so to speak. Whereas strong AI says that the human mind just is a kind of computer, and that computers therefore, in principle, can tell us all that we need to know about the mind. In saying that the human mind just is a kind of computer, what you're saying is essentially the following. There's no difference in principle between my mind and that of a sophisticated computer. My mind has software in it. It's just that my mind runs on wetware as opposed to the hardware that characterizes the machine, but there's no difference in principle. My, for example, knowledge of philosophy or English, the English language, or certain parts of history might just be the instantiation of a program in my particular wetware, and a computer might have the same knowledge, the same capacity instantiated in its hardware. In principle, the differences are relatively trivial. Now, you might wonder whether or not the artificial intelligence community can, if it's in the form of the strong AI view, give us a complete account of the nature of the mind, because, for example, many will agree today that it's possible in principle for a computer to possess cognitive capacities. It seems not as shocking as it might have 50 years ago to talk about a computer as knowing certain things, as deducing certain things, and as remembering certain things. Perhaps now, unlike 50 years ago when we might have used those terms metaphorically, perhaps those are not metaphors anymore, but we actually take them literally. However, you might ask whether passing the Turing test, and question that we considered before, does indeed guarantee consciousness. Now again, caveat, it's not entirely clear that consciousness is required for having a mind, but it does seem like it's required for having minds at all like ours. It seems a characteristic of our minds in our species and those of nearby species that they have conscious experience, and you might ask why it is that having conscious experience is going to be guaranteed for a creature that is built out of hardware. And just to consult intuitions, you might ask yourself, it's one thing to suppose that a non-human, indeed non-organic creature or entity like a sophisticated machine can respond to potential damage to its exterior by moving away and maybe even emitting some screeches. Intuitively, however, it's much harder for us to take seriously the idea that a machine could feel pain. Think about what it would be like to ascribe, literally ascribe, not just metaphorically, but literally ascribe to a machine the capacity to feel pain. That seems very different from our capacity or our tendency to ascribe to our fellow human beings or non-human animals the capacity for pain. Now, it's just not clear what rests on that intuitive feeling of a difference between machines on the one hand and biological organisms on the other. Somebody might say, at least for the case of pain and qualitative experiential states, we want to be chauvinists. That is, maybe you really have to have white matter or gray matter or a combination of the two in order to have experiential states. Whereas for the case of cognition, perhaps we should not be chauvinists, we should be as liberal as we can. Smart is as smart does or tends to do. As long as you have some physical instantiation that runs that program, that's what it is to have cognitive states. Whereas you might draw a differentiation between the cognitive and the affective, and then likewise, insofar as emotions are a kind of hybrid of cognitive and affective states, for example, to feel angry generally involves both thinking that somebody has done something wrong or inappropriate, while at the same time having that experience of burning inside, the sort of fist-clenching nature of rage. This seems like it's got an experiential or qualitative dimension as well. Then our implication would be, insofar as machines can have cognition but not experience, so too machines can only have the parts or aspects of emotions, namely the cognitive aspects of the emotions, but not any experiences. And if moods are much more experiential than cognitive, so too you'd expect machines to be capable of very minimal or maybe none at all moods. So as we think in a more careful way about what's required for different dimensions or aspects of the mind, we might find that some parts or some dimensions of artificial intelligence seem attractive. That is, it seems that many of us are willing to accept the idea that machines are capable of some aspects of mentality, namely the cognitive aspect. But we're much more resistant to the idea that they're capable of experience, the qualitative aspect of mentality, and we might be able to say, on those points, we want to hold our ground, dig in our heels, and say we're going to be chauvinists there. You've got to be made of gray or white matter or both to have those experiences, but liberal when it comes to cognitive states.